a hidden blade, a locked throne room, and a lone assassin walking right into the belly of the enemy. This is not a parable. This is not a metaphor. This is history. Violent, strategic, and breathtaking in its audacity. The story of Ehud, son of Gera, a left-handed deliverer sent by God to end 18 years of brutal occupation. Judges chapter 3 verse 12 tells us that the people of Israel had done evil in the sight of the Lord again. And so God strengthened Eglon, the king of Moab, against them. Eglon was not just a regional troublemaker. He rallied the Ammonites and the Amalekites, ancient enemies of Israel, and they came like a flood. They captured the city of palms, Jericho itself, and planted their banner in the land God had given his people. For 18 years, Israel lived under Moabite boots. Judges chapter 3 verse 14. 18 years of forced tribute. 18 years of humiliation. 18 years of watching foreign soldiers patrol their streets, tax their crops, and mock the God of Abraham. Can you imagine that kind of oppression? Not for a week, not for a season, for nearly 2 decades. Long enough for children to be born and raised in captivity. Long enough for hope to turn to resignation. But something shifts in Judges chapter 3 verse 15. When the people of Israel cried out to the Lord raised up for them a deliverer, Ehud, the son of Gera, the Benjaminite, a left-handed man. Let that detail settle. Left-handed. In ancient Hebrew culture, the left hand was considered weaker, unclean, awkward. Warriors trained with the right. To be left-handed was to be marked as different, unusual, a disadvantage. Unless, of course, you were planning an assassination. The Israelites sent Ehud to bring tribute to King Eglon. This was not unusual. Tribute was a regular humiliation, a parade of Israel's defeat delivered right into the lap of their oppressor. Carts of grain, livestock, gold, everything Eglon demanded. And Ehud would carry it personally. But Ehud did not come empty-handed in another sense. Judges chapter 3 verse 16 says, "And Ehud made for himself a sword with 2 edges, a cubit in length, and he bound it on his right thigh under his clothes." A cubit, about 18 inches, not a long blade, short, double-edged, designed for close quarters. And here's the brilliance. He strapped it to his right thigh. When guards searched a man, they checked the left side. That's where right-handed men drew their weapons. But Ehud? His sword rested on the opposite side, concealed beneath the folds of his robe, invisible to anyone patting him down. He walked through the gates, past the Moabite soldiers, past their sneers and their laughter. He carried the tribute into the presence of King Eglon. And Judges chapter 3 verse 17 tells us something important. And he presented the tribute to Eglon, king of Moab. Now, Eglon was a very fat man. This is not an insult, it's intelligence. In the ancient world, extreme obesity was a sign of wealth and excess. Eglon gorged himself on Israel's suffering. While they starved under his taxes, he feasted. His body was a monument to greed, a living symbol of the occupation. Ehud delivered the tribute. He bowed, he played the part, and then he left with the other Israelites who had carried the goods. But he didn't go far. Judges chapter 3 verse 19 says, "But he himself turned back at the idols near Gilgal and said, 'I have a secret message for you, O king,' the sculptured stones, pagan monuments." Ehud waited there, in the shadow of false gods, until the caravan was out of sight. Then he turned, alone, and walked back toward the enemy stronghold. Think about what that took. He had already escaped. He could have kept walking. But deliverance doesn't come from safety. It comes from obedience, even when obedience looks like suicide. He approached the palace and delivered his line, "I have a secret message for you, O king." The Hebrew word is devar seter, a hidden word, a private word. The kind of message kings don't want overheard. Eglon's interest was piqued. Judges chapter 3 verse 19 records his command, "Silence. Everyone out." The guards withdrew. The attendants left. The doors closed. And Ehud stood alone in the upper chamber with the king of Moab. A cool, private room where Eglon conducted his most sensitive affairs. This was it. The moment everything hinged on. Would his hand tremble? Would his courage fail? Would the guards hear the shuffle of fabric as he reached for the blade? Judges chapter 3 verse 20 gives us the scene in breathtaking detail. "And Ehud came to him as he was sitting alone in his cool roof chamber. And Ehud said, 'I have a message from God for you.'" Eglon rose from his seat. Perhaps out of respect, perhaps out of curiosity. The text doesn't say. But it does say this. He stood. And Ehud reached. Judges chapter 3 verse 21. "And Ehud reached with his left hand, took the sword from his right thigh and thrust it into his belly. The sword went in, all of it. Judges chapter 3 verse 22 is graphic, unflinching. And the hilt also went in after the blade. And the fat closed over the blade, for he did not pull the sword out of his belly. And the waist came out. The blade disappeared completely, swallowed by the king's flesh. Ehud didn't retrieve it. He left it buried there, the instrument of judgment still lodged in the body of the oppressor. Eglon collapsed, and Ehud moved. Judges chapter 3, verse 23 says, Then Ehud went out into the porch and closed the doors of the roof chamber behind him and locked them. He didn't run. He didn't panic. He locked the doors, calmly, deliberately. Then he walked out of the palace. And here's where the tension becomes almost unbearable. Judges chapter 3 verse 24. When he had gone, the servants came, and when they saw that the doors of the roof chamber were locked, they thought, surely he is relieving himself in the cool chamber. They waited and waited, and they waited till they were embarrassed, the text says in Judges chapter 3 verse 25. They didn't want to interrupt the king. So they stood outside, awkwardly delaying, while Ehud put more and more distance between himself and the scene. Finally, they took a key. They opened the doors, and they found their king dead on the floor. By then, Ehud was long gone. Judges chapter 3 verse 26 tells us, Ehud escaped while they delayed, and he passed beyond the idols and escaped to Sirah. He didn't stop running until he reached the hill country of Ephraim. And when he arrived, he didn't collapse in relief. He didn't celebrate alone. Judges chapter 3 verse 27 says, When he arrived, he sounded the trumpet in the hill country of Ephraim. Then the people of Israel went down with him from the hill country, and he was their leader. The trumpet blast, the ancient call to war. Ehud had struck the first blow. Now it was time for Israel to rise. He gathered them and said, in Judges chapter 3 verse 28, Follow after me, for the Lord has given your enemies, the Moabites, into your hand. Not I have given, the Lord has given. This was not Ehud's victory, it was God's. The blade was simply the instrument. The assassin was simply obedient, and Israel followed. They went down to the fords of the Jordan, the crossing points between Moab and Israel. They seized them. Judges chapter 3 verse 28 says they did not allow anyone to pass over. The Moabite officers, scrambling to respond to the death of their king, tried to retreat. They couldn't. Israel cut them off at the river. Judges chapter 3 verse 29 records the result, and they killed at that time about 10,000 of the Moabites, all strong, able-bodied men. Not a man escaped. 10,000. The occupation shattered in a single day. In Judges chapter 3 verse 30 gives us the epilogue. So Moab was subdued that day under the hand of Israel, and the land had rest for 80 years. 80 years. 2 generations grew up in peace because one man was willing to walk into the throne room of his enemy with nothing but faith and a hidden blade. What does Ehud teach us? First, that God often uses the unexpected. A left-handed man in a right-handed world. A physical disadvantage becomes a divine advantage. What the world calls weakness, God calls strategy. Maybe you feel overlooked, underestimated, written off. Ehud's story says, God is not looking for the obvious. He's looking for the obedient. Second, deliverance requires courage in the moment of isolation. Ehud stood alone in that room. No backup, no escape plan, just a mission and a choice. There are moments in life when no one else can stand with you. When the door closes and it's just you and the calling God has given you. Will you move or will you freeze? Third, God's justice is real and sometimes violent. Eglon was not a victim. He was a tyrant. He grew fat on the suffering of God's people. Ehud's blade was the instrument of divine judgment. This is not a story about personal revenge. It's a story about God breaking the chains of oppression through a faithful servant. Finally, one act of obedience can secure rest for generations. Ehud didn't live to see all 80 years of peace, but his children did. His grandchildren did. The fruit of courage often ripens long after the courageous act.